نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. Last week we had discussed some actions that would make the salah invalid. We had mentioned, the last action we had mentioned was, if whilst performing the salah, the time for salah leaves, is finished, is completed, whilst a person is still performing the salah will become fasid. The next point, which makes the salah invalid, is if a person has a bandage or a cast for that matter, or something which they have tied on which they are making masah for the sake of wudu. So, a person is injured, they have a cast or a bandage, and they're making masah on that for wudu. They're not washing that body part because of the injury, right? Which is permissible, it's fine. But let's say, for instance, whilst performing salah, a person's injury becomes better, and the bandage falls off, or the cast falls off, or whatever it is that the person has tied falls off, or they're not in need of it anymore during the salah, then the salah would become invalid because the wudu has not broken. Meaning that as long as a person needs to do masah on that, the wudu is valid. But now once the necessity to do masah on that bandage or cast, whatever it is that a person has tied, does not remain anymore, then at that moment the person now needs to wash that portion of the body. Because of that, now the wudu has broken. Another example of this or similar is the case wherein a person is wearing leather socks or wudu socks, for example, and the time limit for a person who is a muqim, who's a resident, who's at home, is 24 hours, right? So 24 hours from the first time a person wears the socks in the state of wudu. So the first time they break the wudu after wearing the socks in the state of wudu, that's where the time starts counting. The clock starts ticking. So once 24 hours finishes, now the time for masah is done. Now they have to remove the socks and the wudu will be invalid. They have to wash the feet now, right? So similar in that case, let's say a person is wearing wudu socks or leather socks, and those 24 hours are completed while the person is in salah, right? Then it becomes invalid. So now they have to stop and they have to do their wudu and then redo the salah. The same in the case over here as well. The next one is if a person who is maʿdhūr, their udhr ceases to exist while they're performing salah. So first we have to understand what is maʿdhūr. This is important, especially it can happen to anyone if someone gets an injury, especially to elderly people sometimes, right? Now maʿdhūr means if a person has a shari udhr because of which they are not performing wudu every time that udhr comes, and they're only performing wudu at the beginning time of each salah. Easy example. A person, they got an injury, or let's say they have a continuous nosebleed, right? And the nose is bleeding all the time. And the nosebleed is continuing for the complete time between any two salats. So what is between dhuhr and asr, or asr and maghrib. So the time from one salah to another salah, that nosebleed is continuing. So it can be nosebleed, or it can be a person, maybe they got sick and the doctor put a catheter on their body. So catheter also, what happens is because the urine continuously comes out, now the person, droplets are always coming out into the catheter, right? So that person also becomes a shari maʿdhūr at that time, right? So if a person is maʿdhūr, and the ruling of a maʿdhūr, so any person who gets any sort of udhr means any action that breaks a salah, but if that action happens to such an extent that between the times of any two salah, that action happens so often that that action does not stop happening for that duration between which they can make wudu and perform that salah without that happening. Right? So for that's a continuity of that thing that's happening, whether it's continuous bleeding or continuous urine droplets coming out, or a person has some gas problems, etc. Whatever it may be, there's many different examples of udhr, right? So the person becomes maʿdhūr. So the ruling for that maʿdhūr person is, if that specific udhr happens, the wudu will not break. Only the beginning time of every salah, they have to perform wudu, and that wudu will last them for the entire duration of that salah time. So Asr time comes in, they do wudu. Maghrib time comes in, they have to do wudu again at the beginning time of Maghrib. Isha time comes in, they have to do wudu at the beginning time of Isha. Then within that salah time, they can perform as many salah as they want, nafil salah, whatever. Yes, if their wudu breaks because of some other reason, so the udhr or the excuse they have is, for example, bleeding, but now they want to use the bathroom, so now for that they won't need to do wudu. Right? So this maʿdhūr person, right? Let's say a person is maʿdhūr, and because of that they're performing wudu at the beginning time of every salah. Now during the salah, if that udhr ceases to exist, now that nosebleed that was happening all of a sudden it stops. Whilst a person is performing salah, it completely stops bleeding now. Right? Now that person's udhr is finished. right? So now that person will need to do wudu. So at that moment, the salah would be deemed, invalid, and they would need to go do the wudu again, and they would need to come and perform salah. So we learn two things in this one mas'ala. One is that if a brother stops in the middle of salah, then that breaks the salah. And we also learned what does maʿdhūr mean, right? So this maʿdhūr is very important, especially for elderly people. Sometimes they have this problem, so we should know exactly what are the rulings of a maʿdhūr. A maʿdhūr person also cannot lead the salah. So sometimes because of udhr, if a person has to lead salah, they cannot lead salah if they have a udhr, right, of that nature. So these are two actions that break the salah as well. And so may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to continue learning about our deen. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.